Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I'm about to feed a couple of my worm bins. Over the past couple days I've been trying to get myself caught up because I was away for a little vacation for about a week's time. And granted, before I left I did make sure that all of my worm systems were well fed, so I probably really didn't have much to worry about. In fact, over the past couple days as I've been getting caught up with how all my bins are doing, I have noticed that there have been abundant amounts of residual food from previous feedings in there already. So I'm sure I could have just left all of these systems probably could have gone for another week or so with no problem. But just for good measure, I always like to maintain good supplies of food in my bins. Some people even suggest that maybe I feed a little bit too much, but luckily it's never, so far so good, never led to any sort of a problem. And frankly, a lot of times it's spurred on just by the fact that there's no more room left in my freezer. A lot of times I'll get a supply of kitchen scraps from my mom, and then next thing I know I'm in surplus mode, and that's when I start feeding my worms like crazy. And luckily they seem to keep up pretty good. So a couple days ago I started out by feeding my two oldest, most heavily populated bins. Actually, I only fed one of them, the older of the two bins. At that time I decided that I would let this second oldest bin sort of get into a starvation mode, let it get geared up for harvesting at some point soon. I then proceeded to feeding the systems that have my night crawlers in them, and they're the ones that have the bags within either the frame or within the tub. So those got taken care of yesterday. So really all that remains is the system that you see here, which is my newest red wiggler bin, and the next newest red wiggler bin. So I'm going to be feeding these two systems today. They're really not that old. This one is less than a month old. September 22 is its date. Today we're, I believe, on October 12th. So it's only about 3 weeks or so old. And that bin over there is about a month older than this one. And I've been trying to match up some of my systems so that I feed them in pairs, and this way I can kind of compare them to one another. As long as I know I'm maintaining two systems in tandem with one another, then I can use them as sort of a measure against one another. For example, if one of them starts to develop some sort of a problematic symptom, I've got the other one to compare it to say, hey, how come it's happening here but not here, knowing that I've been managing them in very similar ways. So that's my logic lately in trying to maintain matched sets of bins if possible. So I'm going to get these two bins up onto the bench and get them fed. So why don't we get started? Alright, so the bin that we're going to begin with is now 52 days old, and offhand I don't remember how many times it's been fed, but I would say that if it was an average of once per week, then we're probably talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 8 feedings that have occurred in this bin since that time. That's just a rough estimate. I do keep track of all my information on a tracking spreadsheet that's made numerous appearances here on my channel. And it's kind of a nice thing to always have a quick record to see how old a bin is and what's been done to it recently, how many feedings it's received, and other information I maintain about my bins. So here in this bin, we can see that that plastic that was covering the cardboard that I removed in the beginning is doing a really nice job keeping the moisture within the bin. And this bin, being only 52 days old, less than 2 months old, is one that I typically assume to have probably a higher concentration of stuff that's not yet worm castings versus what is already worm castings. But I'm sure that in this case, this bin is probably getting pretty close to the tipping point where quite possibly there might even be more worm castings in here any more than bedding type materials. And I think just from a quick glance down into that corner over there, I would think that that probably is the case at this point. The plastic does such a good job keeping the moisture in that I do keep it on during the beginning of a bin's early days, because the original materials used to build the bin, stuff like cardboard, stuff like leafy matter. That stuff doesn't really hold water very well. And it kind of stacks up on each other and has little air gaps. And it allows for itself to breathe pretty good and, as a result, emit a lot of moisture. And for that reason, I try to prevent the excess loss of moisture due to evaporation by keeping plastic on top of these newer bins. But at some point in the worm bin's life cycle, I have to come to the realization that if I continue down that road, then the material will no longer be nice and flaky, loose castings. It'll start to get overly damp and it'll start to clump up on itself and become really muddy and unmanageable. And, I guess unmanageability is sort of a relative sort of consideration if you think about it. It's probably very manageable by the worms. I'm sure they love it. But if it were to get to the point where I would want to really maybe get the castings out of the container and potentially run all the material through a sieve to, exclude any larger chunks that have not yet been broken down, then I might find that overly damp material would become very problematic trying to run it through a sieve. So I use that as sort of my gauge as to how good I think material is from a moisture perspective. If it seems screenable, it seems like the material would easily enough pass through a screen, then I treat that as being kind of the right moisture level. If it gets really muddy and clumpy and sticky, then I start to grow a little bit concerned that maybe things are getting overly damp and it's time to start letting the bin dry out a little bit. And I'm really starting to feel that that might be the case here. The moisture levels are really nice, and the material flakes away really nicely too. But it feels to me like if I continue to try to really keep moisture in the bin any longer, then it could start leading to problems. And what I'm noticing here, I started spotting it as I was probing down into the material right underneath the top of the surface. If we peel back some material, yeah, we see some worms, but what I'm really referring to is, I'm not sure if the camera's picking it up, but there is a whole bunch of really, really tiny little white insects cruising around within this material. And it's something that I typically don't really see too much in my bins. I mean, if I see somewhat larger insects that are kind of round in shape, then I know that they're mites, but these are not mites as far as I can tell. I believe, again, this is just based on having seen other people's videos and the way they identify certain things in their bins. I think what I might be seeing here are maybe, I'm not sure, this might be springtails? I'm not even sure. And, it could possibly be that I've allowed things to get a little bit too damp in this bin. And that might just be the explanation as to why I'm starting to see what appears to be a little bit of an outbreak over here of a creature other than worms, basically. I accept the fact in my worm bins that there's always going to be, yeah, look at that, a variety of companion creatures in my bins in addition to the worms. But once in a while, some other sort of a creature starts to really take on great numbers. And this is actually probably my first experience observing this much of this type of tiny white insect. And I'm going to do my own research on this before I try to make any sort of conclusive statements about what they are. But I've watched many other YouTube videos out there and seen the sort of things other people encounter in their bins, and I'm just kind of having a little bit of a hunch here that those might be that what we're seeing in here might be what's known as a springtail. And once again, I've got to do some research because I don't really know for sure, but if I'm not mistaken, they are relatively harmless in a bin. They are kind of a helper companion to the worms. So I don't think there's anything to worry about or react radically to at this point. I think we're probably in good shape, so I don't think I need to panic. But I will be doing a little bit of research after I get done feeding this bin to try to get a better understanding of what exactly it is that's being observed in here. So as we start poking through the feeding area down the middle here, we're encountering a lot of material that I use as bedding. We've got a coffee filter here. We've got scraps of cardboard. This was a paper tube. In this case, it's the shorter one. I believe it's a toilet paper tube, or it could have just been a paper towel tube cut in half. And as I probe around down where the last feeding was administered to this bin, at this point 10 days ago, if I'm not mistaken, I'm finding only worms basically. I'm not seeing any signs of any of the previous food that this bin would have been given. And it's not too surprising, I guess, right? If you look at the quantity of worms in here. I've been trying to estimate how many worms I've got in each of my systems. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that the estimate for this bin, as well as the next bin, is that we think we've got ourselves something in the neighborhood of about 3,000 worms in here. And it's always possible that I'm wrong. There could be even more in here than that. But I think that that's the rough number that I've been going with on this bin, or both of these bins that we're going to be tending to today. I am sensing the smell of something familiar. Oh, you know what it is? I've encountered this while feeding in my other bins. I believe it was yesterday when I encountered some pasty stuff. And it may have been added to these bins as well. And that pasty stuff was actually what remains of this cereal right here, which I was planning on feeding today too. And I think that smell is kind of like a brown sugar or molasses, kind of a sweet scent. And you know, it might not even be coming out of the bin, to tell you the truth, because the container is sitting right here next to me with the top off. And I actually think that the smell is coming from the container of the cereal itself, not from the worm bin. Worm bins generally don't have too much of a scent to them, unless things are going a little bit awry. And that's definitely not the case here. I believe what we're observing in here is pretty good, actually. Nice busy bin, nice moisture level, possibly a little bit too much of those tiny little white creepy crawlies. But we'll do a little research to figure out what the deal is with those things, just to make sure we're not allowing some sort of a crazy situation to persist when it needs countermeasures. If anyone out there has any insights into what those are, then I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear what people think those little creepy crawlies were that we observed here in this bin. So I'm kind of following suit with what I've done in the majority of my other systems, is that I didn't add any fresh bedding. I didn't add any grit to the feeding. All I did was I dumped in some fresh food. And we're going to do the same here today. So I've created a little bit of a ditch down here so that once I put the food in, I've got some material piled up on the sides with which I can cover up the feeding. So one of the things we're going to apply is some of this potato peel. There's also some cantaloupe rinds, which are going to bring in a fair bit of moisture, probably a little bit more moisture than the potato peels are bringing in. And then, like I said earlier, I'm going to be using some of this breakfast cereal. So I'll save half for the other bin. And this should provide a pretty good feeding for this bin, at least for a little while. I would have to say that of all my bins, this bin is probably the one that's gotten the furthest along with the last feeding that it received. And it might just be that that last feeding was not quite as large as what all the other bins were fed before I went away on my little getaway. Maybe I've got more worms in here than I estimate. Maybe they've just got a larger appetite than I'm anticipating. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on. If this bin needs to be fed a little bit more frequently or in greater amounts, then I've got to be wary of the fact that maybe my methods need to be fine-tuned to suit the needs of the bin. It's a pretty good piece of bedding that I was, using as bedding. I figured, what I was going to do is just keep it off to the side here and use it as an indicator to show where we last fed. And nowadays I've been, for the most part, feeding my bins down the middle. So it might be unnecessary to mark where the last feeding occurred, but I kind of do it out of tradition at this point. So it is a little bit unusual sometimes for me to check one of my bins and not find a indicator to show where I last fed. But usually I'm able to figure it out pretty quickly, even if I don't have it marked. So this bin looks really nice. I love the texture of the material, and for that reason, I believe what I'm going to do is I'm going to eliminate the use of that cardboard that's covered with the large plastic bag. And before I kind of lock that decision in, I want to take a quick look at it just to make sure I don't have any worms lingering on here. Because if I do, then that could really be bad for them. If they're left on here and the stuff starts to dry out, they've got nowhere to go that's damp, they'll dry out too, just like the stuff that's on this, and that won't be good. So I did find that one little worm that I placed over here, and I think in the place of that cardboard with the plastic covering on it, I'm going to go with something that's going to allow for a little bit more airflow. So there won't be any plastic covering this container any longer. I'm going to assume that this material is, at this point, maybe even more castings than not. And with that being the case, I'm going to assume that it's able, on its own, to retain a lot of the moisture content that it has right now, without drying out too quickly. And naturally, if I realize that that was not the right decision and I do need to reactivate the plastic covering approach to keep moisture in the bin, then I will do so at some point in the future. But I believe at this point, before things get too damp, I believe it's the right time to start allowing for just a little bit more airflow in this container. So the new covering that I'm going to continue with in this bin is going to be this piece of newspaper, folded up to suit basic dimensions of the top surface of the material inside, leaving a little bit of room around the sides to breathe, but mainly providing a covering edge to edge, but still a material that will allow for a little bit of moisture to permeate through and escape the bin if necessary. So my hope is that this stuff will not get any more damp as a result of the melon or the potato that I threw in here, and that it'll stay pretty much the moisture that it's at right now. And naturally, like I said earlier, if I find that it's evaporating too quickly and drying out, then I'll be able to adapt to that and, potentially bring back the covering with plastic. But for now, the plastic's going to stay off, and we'll keep an eye on how things look in here. And I'll be definitely looking into what those little white critters were. All right, let's move on to the next bin. So now here, in the newest of my red wiggler bins, we're dealing with an environment that's been in service now for 20 days. So we're just a day shy of it being 3 weeks old. And here too, we've got plastic covering up the majority of the top surface. The one thing I really like about the plastic is that when you come back into the bin, the moisture that collects as a result of that plastic being there creates a spot that the worms really, really enjoy hanging out in. So I'm always kind of greeted with a mass of worms all hanging out on the top of the surface, trying to take advantage of the moisture that collects there. But like we did earlier, we're just going to make sure that we don't leave any worms on here if possible, because their tendency is going to be try to squirm away because of the bright lights overhead, and they could potentially find themselves on the floor or somewhere else on my table where I might not notice them, and that could really lead to their demise pretty quickly. Now here on the surface we can see another covering, which is this piece of newspaper. And a piece of newspaper generally doesn't last very long when it's covered with that plastic because of what you see here. The worms come up top to hang out, take advantage of the collecting moisture, and while they're at it, they also take advantage of this piece of paper to utilize it as food. So they nibble away at it, and in time it gets consumed just like everything else in the bin. But while it's still relatively intact, as this piece is, I'll try to hang on to it and keep using it as sort of a top covering. And at some point it could require a replacement. But for now I think we're still good enough with this piece of paper. Presumably we can hang on to the other one too. Although I do need to be very delicate with handling it because it's completely soaked. And a piece of newspaper that's completely soaked, like you saw right here, has a tendency to tear very easily. And even though I took a pretty good chunk out of it right there, I think we're still in good enough shape to continue using this piece of paper together with the other half to continue covering up the majority of the bed right beneath the plastic. So sometimes I just grow impatient and I start getting a little bit more rough, and there I am tearing more bits and pieces off this paper. So hopefully we'll eventually be left with something that I can in fact reuse as hoped. I just really want to try to get rid of these little guys before I set the paper aside. So I believe we've gotten the majority of them. And at the same time we've managed to preserve the piece of paper. You might have noticed that there was also the indicator in here. The coffee filter was trying to show where this bin was last fed, but it's seen better days obviously, and it's obviously also hardly recognizable as a coffee filter anymore. But as luck would have it, I've got a whole bunch of them, so we'll just go ahead and replace it when we're done feeding. So this stuff that remains of it will simply become additional bedding. And in this case, you can really see, you know, a month difference between the two bins. This one being 20 days old, the other one being 53 days old, I believe it was. You can really see what a difference a month makes. All this stuff will hopefully in that much time too also break down. But in this bin you would definitely have to agree with me when I say that the majority of the bedding is not yet castings material. It's still mainly leafy matter, cardboard, paper, all the stuff that the bin was originally built with. So here we'll definitely be keeping the plastic in place to keep the ongoing recirculation of the moisture in the bin happening the way it's been. And the nice thing about that is that even out here on the outskirts of the bin, all the way out on the corners, there's a lot of nice moisture present in all the material, making it a very welcome spot for the worms to hang out in. So I like the way things look, but we're here to feed, so let's move on to getting that done. Down the middle is where I fed here too. That's generally my typical method. some point I'll get to the point where I'm ready to stop treating it as a composting bin and try to steer it towards the point where I can harvest the castings out of there and get the worms moved out. At that point, I'll start typically feeding on one or the other edge of the bin to try to move the worms out of the castings material. But most recently, I've been focusing the feedings in my bins down the center of the container for the most part. I'm assuming that this is maybe a combination of castings and maybe residual coffee from the last feeding. It just doesn't have that feel to it like if it were castings. I think it's still leftovers from the previous feeding. So even though the other bin that we just fed, the slightly older of the two, probably has about the same number of worms in it as this one, it does seem to have gotten done with the last feeding that it received. Much more than this one. So I'm already seeing what appears to be not only coffee scattered over the top, but what appears to be maybe a half of an apple here. There's a piece of paper right below it. So we've got leftovers. So there was certainly nothing to worry about in this bin. I would say that that last bin that we fed a few minutes ago was probably the bin out of all of my systems that was most in need of food. And who knows, maybe it was those little white bugs that were helping to break down the food so much more quickly in there than I've seen in any of my other systems. I am pleased, though, that I'm not seeing any of those little white bugs in here. I'm sure that they're present, and I'm sure if I review the video, I'll see them, but they don't seem to jump out, visibly, when I look in here the way it did in the other bin. So while I'm certain that they're in here in certain amounts, it just doesn't seem like they're thriving as much in here as they are in the other bin. So you can see we've got ourselves a pretty hardy worm population in here, the majority of which I have, for the most part, moved over to the side. Try to get them out of our way so we could add more food. And as I like to do, I like to try to lay down at least a little bit of uncomposted bedding type material beneath where the new food gets added, so there's stuff for the juices of the food to drip down into. And it definitely helps promote the breakdown of all that bedding a lot more quickly than if it was just sitting on the top of the surface of the material or something. So I think what we'll do here is we'll restore some of these food scraps that we found from the previous feeding or feedings, and make sure it's down there before we apply the fresh food. So I know that there's scraps of it here and there. I kind of threw it all about in a disorderly fashion. I should have probably kept it all in one place to make its collection later less of a scavenger hunt. But I think we've gotten the majority of it here. So yeah, let's get the fresh food piled in here too. Presumably I've piled enough stuff up on the two sides to give us enough to cover up with when we're finished. So what remains here is about an equal portion to what the other bin received. Again, it's the potato peels. Seems to be more than what the other bin received. And some cantaloupe rinds, again, seeming to be a little bit more than the other bin received. So maybe I did things a little bit backwards here. Maybe that other bin that we fed first should have received a more plentiful quantity of food. But it probably doesn't matter so much. Things sort of level off in the end. I'm sure I'll be back in that other bin before the food supplies get completely tapped. And in this bin, I'm sure we'll be even better off in terms of the food supply not running out. Oh, but I almost forgot. Let's not forget to apply this cereal. And at this point, I think I'm tapped out of that too. So we'll just use what remains of that stuff. And you can see it's, you know, in large part it's puffed rice, kind of like a Rice Krispie type stuff, but there's also oats in here. And there were nuts, I believe, too. I believe I saw little bits of maybe walnut or pecan or even almond. So there's a pretty good variety of different stuff in here. And this is the stuff that I believe ends up getting kind of pasty in the end. So I believe when I see some of this white gooey stuff, I believe it's leftovers of that stuff because it was applied once previously in this bin, I believe. So that's one thing I try to do, is make sure that the feedings that I give them are submerged deep enough below the surface of the bin that it doesn't end up drawing a lot of passerby insects that might sense the food and try to come over and take advantage of the food. And luckily we've got other coverings to also place on here. So one of them is the coffee filter, which I'm actually going to use as a little bit of a paper towel here to try to evict all these worms off my glove. I can see a few of them for sure. Some of them are really, really tiny too. So let's hope that we've gotten the majority of them off. It does look like we have, before we place that down in here. And then we can go ahead and start restoring some of these paper coverings that were on here too. But I have a funny feeling that this could very well be the end of this newspaper material, and it might be necessary to replace it next time we come in here. But for now, I believe it looks like it's a fairly intact surface that can continue to serve the purpose that it was serving before, which is sort of a catch surface for the recirculating moisture that goes round and around in the bin, thanks to the plastic covering that we keep over the top surface. And it's kind of nice that this piece of plastic seems to go right out to the very edges of the container. It's doing a really wonderful job keeping the moisture down in the bin. And since it is somewhat translucent and the light can go through it, I wouldn't want any sort of bright light out here in the wormery to become a deterrent to prevent the worms from wanting to come up and take advantage of the moisture. So the cardboard really serves as nothing more than just a light shield to keep it nice and dark and cozy for the worms. So that's it for today, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. I've got myself a little bit of cleaning up to do around here, and I'll put everything away, but I'm not going to take up your time with that. I'm going to sign off now, but before I do, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Bye now.